Joe Biden's epic foreign policy failures that led to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 was universally seen as a catastrophic disaster by most. But in actual reality, it is a huge win for the West and the United States. Let me explain why. The Russian special military operation into Ukraine was initially predicted to be a quick affair by both Kremlin intelligence and Western governments, but they didn't factor in two important things: the awesome power of corruption inside the Russian military and the incredibly effective resistance from the Ukrainians. Russian military pre-invasion is nothing like what it was thought to be during the invasion, and now the whole world knows the actual strength of their military after the invasion. You see, an attack that was meant to capture the capital and most of Ukraine in 3 or 4 days, in reality dragged out into a war of attrition. And Russians are not prepared to fight a war of attrition. Here's a comparison between the standard medical kit given to a Russian soldier versus what the Ukrainians are provided with.
Oh no!
Now, comparing both of them, we can agree that they are pretty basic. But if you actually look at the Russian medical kit, you're literally given a little more than a handbook, a few pieces of paper, some straps and bandages. Then, what about the Russian body armor? This is what was promised by the Kremlin. Apparently, Russian combat suits can survive 50 caliber bullets, have built-in night vision, water filters, and communication equipment. Honestly, that does look pretty scary. But in actual reality, this is what the Russian soldiers were using. Just in case you were confused by what you're looking at, what you're seeing is a captured Russian soldier's body armor, made from hardened cardboard, which is not bulletproof. Ukrainians, on the other hand, were being provided with American-made body armor that is not made from hardened cardboard, but actual bulletproof material. You know how body armor should be. Then, don't even get me started about how much weapons, equipment, and ammunition NATO is just literally giving to the Ukrainians for them to blow up Putin's army with. And that's on top of the Lend-Lease Act for Ukraine. It's easy to see now why the Russians are having such a hard time. Whilst for Ukrainians the conflict was undoubtedly traumatic, as it served as the proxy battlefield for the two real powers on either side of the battleground, NATO and Russia, ironically, they are not the biggest losers. Russia, already lacking friends in the world arena, has reminded every other nation on Earth how fragile international relations and weak global supply chains are by systematically disrupting it and ruining it for everyone else. To put things bluntly, Putin's miscalculation has rowed his nation of Russia in a boat up Poop Creek with no paddle. Had Moscow's initial plot of a swift, decisive victory worked out like it did in the 2014 Crimean offensive, then the Kremlin may have found itself only facing planned costs worthwhile for the benefits of expanding into Ukraine. However, as the war continued, it became increasingly clear that the Russian army was nowhere prepared as the world thought it was, and the Ukrainians learned their lesson in 2014, and this time would not give up without a fight. And fight they did, putting up so much resistance that Moscow will end up in a significantly worse off position than before, in effect, making this invasion a geopolitical gift to the West. If Ukraine were alone, without NATO support, then their economy would have easily reached unsustainable levels within days or weeks and would have been overwhelmed by Russia. Although civilians of the Ukraine bore the brunt of costs in terms of human lives, in economic terms, the West is in a far better position compared to pre-invasion Russia, especially since severe sanctions were levied on the already fragile Russian economy. Even if the measures of the sanctions do affect the Western allies too, it is Putin's regime by far that feels the heat the most. Ukraine's economy is undoubtedly a mismatch with Russia's. Even bigger, though, is the mismatch between Russia and NATO. Although much larger in size in terms of land mass and population, Russia's economy is little smaller than Italy's, which is hardly Europe's engine. Paper numbers aren't likely to be the only thing that becomes increasingly crappy for Russia. Although Ukrainian losses are bad, Russian losses are proportionately worse. This is even more embarrassing for Putin, since Russia, with the world's second strongest military pre-invasion, was unable to conquer Ukraine, the world's ranked 22nd military, and it was even the case before it received significant support from the West. It's precisely because the Russians were underperforming so badly for so long did the NATO allies finally realize after a few weeks, holy cow, Putin's military sucks. Maybe Ukraine can actually hold on. Let's send them more guns and see how it goes. Although it is true that throughout history, Russia suffered a lot of casualties from its vast land during times of war, this Ukrainian invasion is not the same. In the past, lots of dead Russians were much more acceptable, as it was, after all, in order to protect the greater good and defend the motherland from marauding invaders. However, even the dumbest Russian Igor can see that the Ukraine is nothing like those evil German Nazis hell-bent on destroying and pillaging the local Russian population. As such, no degree of propaganda is going to make the Russian people okay with such casualty numbers, as it becomes increasingly clear how little defensive element there was to this special military operation. Not only is a poor picture being painted at home, but Russia's global image has also been left in tatters. Beijing, which in the past has been keen to position itself against NATO in any possible way, has distanced itself from Moscow. In fact, Russia's unpopular invasion has opened up a discussion in Beijing about the need to integrate with the global economy better. This includes the inevitable and unpopular step of cooperating more with the West. Scholar Hu Wai's piece titled Possible Outcomes of the Russia-Ukrainian War and China's Choice, in particular, made waves in Beijing. A Russia/China alliance, only not too long ago, looked like the main global bulwark against Western hegemony. But a wedge has now been pushed between these frenemies as the rest of the world unifies against Russia, and by proxy, against China, which means China secretly hates Russia even more. Why? Well, thanks to Putin's special operation, this has created more tension between Beijing and the West. The invasion of the Ukraine is providing food for thought for people interested in China's relationship with Taiwan. CIA Director Bill Burns recently claimed that Chinese President Xi Jinping was unsettled by the war in Ukraine. However, he also said that he doesn't, for a minute, think that it's eroded Xi's determination over time to gain control over Taiwan. The West's subtle support of Taiwan's independence is not welcomed one bit in China, but Beijing is unlikely to push the issue anytime soon, having seen the fiasco in Ukraine. On top of that, China has its own internal issues to deal with that are more pressing. As such, by creating this cooling-off space, Putin has shot himself in the foot once more and diminished one of the key bonding points of the Sino-Russian relations. That was their shared hatred of the West. Since the invasion, the U.S. is increasingly making their support for Taiwan's independence known in less than subtle ways. The United States State Department on May 5, 2022, updated a section on its website. It removed key language previously stating that the U.S. does not support Taiwanese independence and removed wording acknowledging Beijing's position that Taiwan is part of China. On top of that, the website added additional statements in relation to the 6 assurances, referring to 6 Reagan-era security assurances given to Taiwan, which the United States declassified in 2020. These 6 assurances effectively state that the U.S. would continue to support Taiwan even if it had earlier cut former diplomatic relations. And if that doesn't make the U.S. stance towards their support for Taiwan obvious enough, then this interview with Joe Biden will erase all doubts.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made.
In doing so, this shows Beijing that perhaps the U.S. does agree with Taiwan's stance that it is in fact an independent country and not part of China. NATO hasn't provided an overt show of military muscle since the invasion began, but in the weeks after, there has been one thing on clear display at the bloc. They are now a family even closer than ever. Since 2016, the relationship between NATO nations and key allies has been bumpy. Even since Trump was replaced by Joe Biden, the future of the bloc was brought into question. In 2021, France threw a tantrum at Australia, the United States and the UK when a $90 billion nuclear submarine deal was scrapped without warning. Germany's brazen openness and cooperation with Russia on projects like the Nord Stream pipelines was rubbing plenty of Western friends the wrong way before it was called off in February this year. Cooperation, or lack of, with China has been a growing point of tension among NATO allies in recent years. A lack of NATO unity was something to embolden Beijing on the global stage, but that trend has rapidly U-turned in recent months. Instead, the world has seen how quickly Western powers can band together in moments of importance, setting aside all disagreements. Just like Power Rangers, when the need to show force may arise against China, should they decide to take Taiwan. This is a great money-making opportunity for the defense industry, particularly in the U.S. Titans of weapons manufacturing have gladly met demand to ramp up production so stocks can be replenished. Whilst the large-scale production of tools of war isn't normally without controversy, the flow of weapons from the West to Ukraine was met with almost universal support. Whilst in recent years the reluctance for military investment in countries like Germany has been a point of tension in NATO, it is now firmly a point of agreement. Nearly all the nations comprised of NATO have increased significantly their defense budgets. Prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many in Europe viewed America's staunch defense of its arms industry with skepticism, especially with atrocities in the Middle East, like a U.S.-made bomb killing 40 Yemeni children on a school bus in 2018. However, for some reason, none of these European nations are criticizing America anymore for their enormous military when an actual threat of Russian shells potentially landing inside their own borders becomes a reality. European reluctance to get caught up in what was previously perceived as simple American warmongering is now a told you so moment. And ironically, we have Biden to thank for all of this. The failure of his administration to peacefully broker a deal with Russia and Ukraine that led to the Ukrainian invasion served as a slap to the face, and now the Europeans too understand the benefits of staying prepared. The arms industry has a new opportunity to be seen as the force for good it wants to be seen as. The shift has happened almost overnight. This is great for the armaments business. Raytheon Technologies, for example, has seen their share prices increase by up to 15% in the last 6 months. Demand is pouring in. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz marked the biggest foreign policy shift in Berlin since World War II when he announced that they would continue sending heavy weapons to Ukraine.
Hello, Kiev. Hello, Ukraine. We stand with you.
Not long before, they announced plans to buy 35 state-of-the-art F-35 fighter jets from Lockheed Martin. Poland has also purchased General Dynamics tanks from the U.S., among other battle vehicles, in an order totaling $4.7 billion. Defense Minister Mariusz Błaszczak said the first delivery of 26 tanks will arrive in Poland this year and be deployed east of the Vistula River to dissuade any potential aggressor. It's not just within NATO where countries are pulling together either. After years of lackluster discussion about a long-term possibility somewhere in the distant future, Sweden and Finland suddenly want instant and immediate integration into the NATO bloc. What's more ironic is that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has actually resulted in the exact opposite of what Russia was hoping to gain from it. According to Moscow, their invasion was a direct response to NATO encroachment on Russia's sphere of influence. They claimed they needed to take Ukraine to solidify their own national borders. However, after their unprovoked invasion, they're going to end up with another security risk that they created, this time to the north, along the 1,340-kilometer border between themselves and Finland, as this invasion served as the trigger for the Finnish into joining NATO.
And Finns are not scared, but surely we are full of it.
Strengthening previously strained European ties and destroying Russia through a proxy war via Ukraine isn't the only win for the West either. The invasion provides not just a catalyst for greater NATO unification, but also the ability for Western arm manufacturers to test their weapons of war and see how they perform live on the battlefield, without risking any lives of their own citizens. I mean, why waste your own lives when you can have Ukrainians dying for you, right? American and British-made defense systems such as Stinger, Javelin, and NLAW missiles are being used to devastating effects to repel the Russian invasion. The war is not only demonstrating that the tools for self-defense are necessary, but are often extremely effective, however expensive they are. An isolated battle between Ukraine and Russia would consist a lot of Soviet technology versus Soviet technology, most of which was designed for conflict in Western Europe directly against NATO tech during the Cold War, such as T-72 tanks. However, Western governments, without expending a single soldier of their own, are rapidly learning how even the newest tech can be combined with older tech. Outdated Soviet grenades, which potentially endanger the thrower as much as anyone else, for example, are being attached to drones so they can be deployed accurately and remotely. It's not just technology to be used for explicitly military purposes that is getting a helpful trial run at the cost of the blood of Ukrainian defenders too. Finally, social media can be used for something more than posting butt photos and thirst traps online. American firm Clearview AI has provided facial recognition technology to Ukraine for free so they can identify killed Russian soldiers. This is in the hope of then finding their social media accounts to notify family members and provide the Russian population with a demoralizing but accurate depiction of what's happening on the ground. Why is this needed, you might ask? Are you telling me the evil Ukrainians are hiding the bodies of dead Russians so they cannot be identified? The reality is actually far worse. Instead of identifying their dead, Moscow is literally hiding or abandoning bodies on the battlefield to reduce the number of reported deaths in this conflict. And there's even more bad news for Russia. Perhaps the largest reason why suddenly the whole world is united against Russia is because Putin is literally costing them money by the impact of the supply chain disruptions. By alienating the rest of the world, Russia has severely restricted how it can adjust to this, especially with Western sanctions. The West, on the other hand, has a great room of maneuverability to protect its asset long-term from conflict on the continent. Currently, almost 300,000 companies in the U.S. and Europe have suppliers in Russia and the Ukraine. None of them will be pleased with the current disruptions, and all will be looking into safer alternatives. Large-scale conflict is extremely rare on the North and South American continents. Companies who might have been looking at setting up facilities in Central Europe, such as many big tech companies recently have, may now look to move shop across the Atlantic. North America is safe from conflict, whilst being one of the few places that offers the same labor market benefits as Europe. The U.S. US-China trade war and COVID-induced disruptions have already made things crappy globally in recent years. Then, Putin just had to come in with his invasion and make a bad situation even worse. Russia's economy is increasingly insignificant on the world scale. Their last few allies are being forced to turn their backs, such as China, in an attempt to save themselves. Adjusting to this change will be hard, but the West has plenty of space to adapt. In effect, Putin's attempt to bring Russia back as an important player on the world stage has allowed him to discover the light at the end of the tunnel, except it's from the headlight of an oncoming train. After this train wreck, there will be even more isolation for them. The sense of paranoia that has plagued Russian geopolitics for decades, which was a major catalyst for this invasion, will only get worse. Increased unity and militarization in Europe, a stronger and more cohesive NATO at its borders, undefinable display of technology and economic superiority by the West, further isolation in times of this global uncertainty. All of these things that instill feelings of mistrust beyond the borders of Russia is now more obvious than ever, except this time, they have proven to be completely incapable of dealing with any of it. The emperor finally has been revealed to wear no clothes. Moscow's clunky invasion of Ukraine has managed to contribute to all of them. And Joe Biden's failed foreign policies dealing with Putin before the invasion is one of the main contributing factors to this. In other words, Joe Biden's Ukrainian failure failed very successfully.